Okay, welcome everybody. We can now make a start. My name is Dolan Cummings and I'll be chairing this session. So welcome to this third session in our strand on the battle for the media in association with Spiked. The topic this afternoon is what is the truth? And I suppose it's axiomatic when people are asked, do you believe what you read in the papers? That you kind of feel you're a bit of a mug if you say yes. So there's always a certain cynicism that goes there. But at the same time, I think none of us would bother reading newspapers or watching television news unless there was some expectation that we are not being lied to and that basically we are getting some kind of truth. So we all know the context of the Leveson inquiry and so on. So we really want to unpack those questions in the contemporary context. I'm going to introduce the panel and hopefully they'll speak more clearly than I am. First to speak will be Mick Hume, who is the editor-at-large of Spiked and the author of There is No Such Thing as a Free Press and We Need One More Than Ever. Second will be Dr. Ruth Dudley Edwards, historian and prize-winning biographer and author of the forthcoming Killing the Emperors on the Conceptual Art Market, which is out at the end of November. Third to speak will be John McAndrew, an associate editor of Sky News, who previously worked in television news at the BBC. Fourth will be Nick Fraser, who's commissioning editor of Storyville at the BBC and the series editor of Why Democracy. And then lastly will be Peter Grimsdale, who's a former Channel 4, 5 and BBC commissioning editor. His credits include Crime Watch and Big Brother, and also Thriller, The Russian, written with Andy McNabb. So, without any further ado, I've asked the speakers to speak for between 4 and 6 minutes, and because we're keeping strictly to time, I will give a yellow card when you have 1 minute left to go, and the red card will use to wind up. Mick.
Okay, well, a nice simple question for 4 minutes. What is truth? I think there's a good reason why when Pontius Pilate asks what is truth, he doesn't actually bother giving an answer because it's a little bit too complicated even for biblical wisdom. But I think it's important today, we're not talking about it in a, obviously it's a huge subject, not talking about it in a philosophical sense, but as it applies to journalism and the media, I think it's important that we make that distinction. I am not a great one, as my book makes clear, for ethical codes in journalism, an attempt to lay down kind of black and white rules for how journalists should and shouldn't behave as a kind of timeless code coming down from a cloud, because I think it's usually an attempt to impose somebody's ethics on somebody else, and it really avoids the necessity for judgment calls in specific circumstances. But if we were to try and say, well, are there some lowest common denominators, some basics of journalism we could agree on as ethical? One is we should certainly, I think we could probably agree that it is immoral to hack the phones of someone like Millie Dowler. But then, as soon as everybody in the world except one News of the World journalist agrees with that, and nobody apart from him attempts to defend it, that's not much of a basis for a moral consensus. It's a pretty low base. But the fact that every journalist should strive to tell the truth is surely something else that we can all agree upon. And it's something I impress on the young people that we talk to every summer at the Young Journalists Academy that we run for sixth form London students. That you should try at all costs never to put your name to something that you know to be untrue. So telling the truth is definitely a basic standard for any decent journalist. But even that, once you look at it, turns out to be not quite as straightforward as is often assumed. Truth is not something that can be assumed or can be received on high from Mr. Assange on his handing it down on his digital tablets rather than the ones made of stone. Truth is something that's got to be fought for, and it's got to be fought for, and journalists have to wade through a kind of minefield of facts, of competing eyewitness accounts, arguments, and political opinions to arrive at what is the truth. It's not something that can be given or assumed. I want to just give one example of that for a couple of minutes, because we haven't got very long, to illustrate it, which has been in the news lately, which is the case of Hillsborough. Everybody knows that the infamous Sun front page that was published after Hillsborough that says the truth, and then proceeded to list a series of lies about the behaviour of Liverpool fans at that disaster. And the recent revelations have exposed the fact that that was all lies. And Kelvin Mackenzie, the Sun editor at the time, has come out and say, it was a lie. Now I realise that it was all lies. And we're all supposed to be shocked. But you see, not everybody believed the Sun's version of the truth 23 years ago. I'd like to show you this. There's the one time in my life I ever wanted an overhead projector and we haven't got one. So old-fashioned technology. This is what's called a photocopy for those of you who are young people. This is the front page of The Next Step, paper of the Revolutionary Communist Party, an article that I wrote in April 1989, a few days after Hillsborough, which says, Hillsborough, the truth, as an opposition to the Sun's one, Thatcher led the law and order drive which caged the fans. The police treated dying fans as a public order problem. Press liars abused the dead to cover up the truth. And makes it clear that what the Sun was doing was repeating police lies. Now that was within 2 or 3 days of the Hillsborough disaster happening. So the facts, particularly to those who watched the whole thing unfolding on television or who had ever been to a football match, the facts, the truth about Hillsborough seemed pretty self-evident to start with. So why did some people choose not to believe that and choose the other interpretation? Because it depended which side you were on. Kelvin Mackenzie and those who believed him were predisposed to believe what the police said about Hillsborough because they were on the side of the state's law and order campaign against football fans. It was a political issue. Many of us were predisposed to believe the alternative point of view because we were on the side of working class football fans. So it isn't simply a question of the facts. It's a question of interpretation. It's a question of opinion. It's a question of where you stand in relation to debate. And still now, even though one says, oh, now we know the whole truth, there are still wrong conclusions being drawn about the truth around Hillsborough. First of all, I think the whole truth has still not come out about it because it's still seen as a mistake rather than an act of the kind of end point of a political crusade. Now, I'll leave that aside for now. But still some wrong conclusions have been drawn about the truth in relation to Hillsborough. I'd like to put in a word for the Sun journalist who actually wrote that terrible article on the front page of the Sun that day, because he wrote that article and he told the BBC when they were making a documentary about it that he was aghast when Kelvin Mackenzie, the editor, who always wrote his own headlines, literally and metaphorically, Mackenzie wrote the headline, "The Truth." And the Sun journalist who wrote the piece said, you can't say that. We don't know that's the truth. That's a version of the truth that we've been given by the police and by the Tories MPs, and it should be reported as such, as their claims. And Mackenzie said, no, we're reporting it as the truth. And so that was the Sun journalist's defence. Now, when this came out recently in relation to documentaries, a lot of the kind of media bloggers were up in arms and said, what a ridiculous claim it is for him to make. There's no such thing as versions of the truth. There's just the truth and there's lies, and we ought to understand that. But of course there are competing versions of the truth. Where do you think the truth comes from? It doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the competing versions, interpretations and arguments that, like in a court case, different versions of the truth are put forward, and then you make your decision about what you believe to be true. And the truth is a battlefield that's got to be fought for by journalists and not assumed. I'm on my last minute, so I think the two traps I'd like to suggest we need to avoid in discussing the truth as journalists is, first of all, the age-old problem of relativism, the idea that there are always many truths and you can never judge what's right and what's wrong. But the other is the assumption that truth can be beyond question. That the truth about anything, from climate change to anything else, can be somehow beyond question, and that scepticism is inevitably wrong. We've got to keep... Everything's got to be open to dispute as journalists searching for the truth, and we should look to capture the spirit of John Stuart Mill, who made a very clear distinction between the 19th century philosopher, who made a very clear distinction between, on the one hand, the idea that something is accepted as truth because on every occasion that it has been questioned and put to the test, it has been proved to be true. We should make a distinction between that and the idea that something should be that we should insist that something is true in order to say it is not open to question. Right? Those are two very different interpretations of the truth. There's something which we believe is true because it's been tested, and something we insist is true because we refuse to have it tested. Those are two very different attitudes to the truth. And our motto as critical working journalists in the 21st century should still be question everything. Thanks very much.
Ruth, your thoughts, please.
I'm going to make this a bit personal. I started out, well, I still am an historian, but it's how I started out. And I was educated in Dublin, in Ireland, when Ireland was in the grip of a view of its history which was wholly nationalistic. And I was fortunate enough to be sitting at the feet of people who were actually trying to explain that there was another narrative of Irish history, that there were such things as Protestants in Northern Ireland who thought differently, that we were not necessarily right in our simple-minded view of the past, and that we should struggle for objectivity. Now, my father was Professor of Irish History there at University College Dublin at the time, and I grew up at home with rows about objectivity. My father said this is what one had to aim for, and everybody else shouted at him that it was impossible, and while I came to believe it was impossible, I also agree with him that one should seek it. And one should seek it as a journalist. I think I was lucky that I didn't start doing any journalism until I had spent decades as a historian struggling to find truth, and always aware that I wasn't getting there, but at least with serious history, the struggle is clear. There are some facts that nobody is going to gainsay, as long as you don't get trapped into, I don't know, the women's studies or black studies or queer studies or any other kind of take on the past, which distorts it, as opposed to the one in which you actually try to find an objective truth from with an open mind, you've got a chance of getting somewhere near truth. And there's also more debate, actually, in history, it has to be said. Then I wrote the history of The Economist. Now, The Economist really tries to get it right. Truly tries to get it right. Is horrified every time it gets a fact wrong. But what was wrong with The Economist, actually, as I said in the history, was that they recruited in their own image. So although, yes, people who came in at the age of 22, having got a first from Oxford, usually Magdalen College, were very clear that they had to get facts right. They had an image of the world which distorted it, because one's image of the world distorts the way one thinks and the way one views even facts. So The Economist of the 1930s, which was driven by a belief that if only everybody is reasonable, everything will be fine, did have a notion that Herr Hitler was showing encouraging signs of statesmanship and all would be well, if only we were all sensible and spoke in low, gentle voices. I did a history of the tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mirror. That was much simpler. And the Mirror, at the time, the 50s and 60s, it was labour supporting, it was pro-working class. You knew where they were. It still believed in truth. It would distort facts, but it wouldn't make them up. It would consciously, it knew it was favouring a point of view, but it wasn't dealing in lies. Which takes me to the BBC. Now, you know, this thing about the BBC being unbiased, I'm sure now there aren't many people anymore that think it's unbiased, because even the BBC has come to admit that it has, with the best will in the world, because it recruits in its own image, it has the point of view of a nice middle-class person, well-educated, living in London, who is rather like The Economist used to be. Somebody who thinks we'll all be nice to each other, and obviously climate change is a tremendous worry, and the only people who don't agree with that are cranks. Andrew Marr, I think it was, talked recently about the average BBC person agreeing with the average, all other BBC persons. The case in point was treatment of Eurosceptics, who really were treated as absolute nutcases. People who were concerned about immigration, well, we know what the problem was there. I don't think you've got any chance in running a newspaper or a broadcasting outfit unless you take your people from a broad spread of opinion, unless you take them educated and not university educated, unless you take them from different classes, different groups, different parts of the country, different life experiences. And one of the things that the BBC never did was to bring in horny, sons of the soil at age 45 who'd laboured away in the thickets of tabloid. Okay, well, that's fine. You can disagree.
No, I don't want to. I don't want to talk about the BBC, actually.
Right. Anyway, so that's what I would say. One of our problems with the media is quite simply that there isn't enough debate and confrontation and disagreement within the very newspapers themselves, because too many of them are run by dictators. I mean, I used to write for the Daily Mail, I still do sometimes, but I was freelance, so when they rang up and said, how do you feel about attacking, Prince Charles or whoever, you could actually say, I don't agree, I'm not going to do it, so you didn't have to do it. But if you actually worked there, you had to think like the editor-in-chief. You have to think like the mass of Mr. Average, Mrs. Average, Ms. Average. So, that's all. Skepticism, as Mick was saying, utterly essential. You should be disagreeing with your own colleagues. You should not be seeing life in the same way that your colleagues do, or you've fallen into the herd mentality, which is the worst trap that journalists can fall into. And that's it. Thank you.
John, you're next.
Hello, I'm from Sky News, and we disagree the whole time. From my point of view, the Leveson inquiry was not what you would call a ratings success. Lots of our viewers wrote in to tell us what they thought of our live coverage, and it wasn't pretty. Mostly it was referred to as a media chatterer's dinner party, and one they didn't feel compelled to attend or watch. When we showed up on our own day to give our evidence, we achieved some of the lowest ratings in our 23-year history, presumably increasing Loose Women's viewing figures by a fair bit as we went. Their message was loud and clear. You journalists sort yourselves out, preferably off-air, and get back to giving us the news and giving it to us straight. Now, of course, if you work for Sky News, or the BBC, I suppose, it is a big story. First, we have to make sure that, despite all the accusations flying around about angles of our coverage, that our approach is beyond reproach. And second, because I think whatever Lord Leveson has in store, it has and will, to some degree, affect the way we operate and the way we deliver the news. And I just think, when Sky News turned up in 1989, we were just on the telly, and it pretty much shook up the way things had been till then. I mean, now in various forms, I saw the other day that our apps have been downloaded by more than 6 million people. People are taking our news at all kinds of day, instant reaction, instant pictures, more than ever before. So the demands on us are in some ways very straightforward. Information, pictures, context, analysis. I mean, everyone knows about Sky having a big whoosh and a red breaking news strap when something happens. But of course, these days we have to be about a lot more than that. And, we have to get it right. News audiences are everywhere, but they're highly promiscuous. They take their news from all kinds of different sources throughout the day. There isn't much loyalty, so people will hop around. So our reputation and accuracy is pretty much everything to us. A few years ago, in the race to be first, when you were just competing, say, against the BBC, every now and then you might make a mistake. You could probably afford to have egg on your face one time out of 100 when you were racing to be first. But if you take that approach now, it will be screen grabbed, twittered, retweeted, and across the internet in no time. And your reputation for truth, accuracy, and being straight will take a hit, and it's one you can't really afford. So we have to trust ourselves to get it right, whether we're in Libya, Syria, whether we're looking at the horrible story about Jimmy Savile. Our audience needs to know that we're telling them the truth and that we're clear about how we operate, transparent and open. Now, sometimes you have to walk the line. Sometimes the course of telling a story means you might come into conflict with the regulator, ethical conflict, or indeed conflict with the law. I think that's, for a reactive channel like ours, that's going to be very, very rare. We don't really do investigations. Stuff happens, we go there, and we hopefully give people the pictures and the facts and the numbers to make their own judgment about it. But on those rare occasions where you're going to come into conflict, possibly with the law and certainly with the regulator, it's important to just let people know what you're doing and how you do it. They know you have to be pursuing a story that's in the public interest, that isn't just a good talking point. I mean, you imagine, for example, MP's expenses is the great example. It would be a shame if any editor didn't go after that kind of story because they felt too cowed that they may be prosecuted or that life may be made difficult for them in other ways. But I'll be clear about what we don't do. Intrusion on the off chance of finding a story is not what we do. We have very little interest in footballers, pop stars, soap stars, who they're sleeping with. A recent case, if you take the Ryan Giggs story that was all over the newspapers, that was one we didn't touch at all until it became a debate on the floor of the House of Commons about the rights and wrongs of rich people having super injunctions, in which case it becomes a legitimate news story. So we're able then to go after it. We trust our journalists and ourselves on screen and off, really, to make the right decisions. Yes, we have an editorial code. It's fairly short, it's fairly simple. It means it's about fairness. It's about being fair with people we interview. It's about not surprising people. It's about not agreeing to do interviews with people who say they'll only talk about certain things. It's Cabinet Minister, you have to ask me this question first. We don't do that kind of thing. And we've set it out in a revised code of conduct that anyone who wants to see it can see on our website. Our journalists have it. I sent a copy to Lord Leveson, to Keir Starmer, and we sent copies to Ofcom. And you can look at our coverage of those kind of stories to get an idea of how we operate. We hit the B Sky B News International, the hacking story, I think, as hard as anyone in journalism, even when it was uncomfortable for us, because in some ways it was close to home and we were open to accusations, lots of them wrong, that we were somehow sort of mixed up in this. My great quote about this is from Charlie Brooker, who's not always a friend to Sky News, but he said our coverage knocked the BBC into a shit bin, which I don't really know what he meant, but it sounded like we probably got something right, if that was the kind of response we were getting. What I would say is that since Sky News came along in 1989, it shook up what was a very, very cosy appointment-to-view terrestrial system of getting your news. So whatever comes out of Leveson and all that surrounds it, I just hope that Sky and others are left free to continue to do that.
Nick, further, your thoughts, please.
Well, I feel really nervous about talking about the truth on Sunday. I'd always been told that you should avoid doing both those things, particularly Sundays for obvious reasons. I actually largely agree with Ruth about the BBC, but I don't think that the BBC's outbreaks of conformity are caused by the fact everyone reads The Guardian at the BBC, which most of them do, and that everyone is terrified by the Daily Mail, which most of them are. I think that large organisations are on the whole inimical to ideas and fresh ideas, and the BBC has always steered a moderate course with not always very satisfactory conclusions, though it has to be said they're somewhat better than those of any outcome of any other public broadcaster in the world. I think if you want a test of the BBC's timidity, you need to know that Isaiah Berlin was never given the Reith Lectures. And if you examine the Reith Lectures, which are the BBC's statement of what is important to itself, you will find them consisting mainly of non-entities delivering lectures on subjects that nobody was interested in at the time and nobody can remember. And I would include in that actually Neil Ferguson's this year, that were a lot of cuttings jobs and were really not worthy of the whole thing. So that's my views about the BBC. I think 2 years ago, I, for a variety of personal reasons, began to read about people I consider to be truth junkies. And they're a small club. They include, self-evidently, Milton, Mill, Solzhenitsyn, Voltaire. Has anyone heard of Ida Tarbell? No. Well, you should read Ida Tarbell's expose of Standard Oil. It's probably, it inaugurated modern journalism. She was a very private person, probably a crypto-lesbian. She got really no credit for the savagery which she pursued John D. Rockefeller for 2 decades, and it's a marvelous story. So, I mean, my conclusion is, if you really want to tell the truth, you have to work outside organizations, and you will end up very poor indeed. The person I found most striking in my investigations was Tom Paine, who is someone scandalously underrepresented in British history. The nearest person we have to Tom Paine in recent times was Christopher Hitchens, but there's a difference. That is that, wonderful as he was, and he was a pal of mine, he would be the first person to admit that his fortune was created by Vanity Fair magazine, and he did not always take highly unpopular positions. Tom Paine did. As you may know, he started off making women's corsets in Thetford. The Rights of Man was written in an Islington pub. He was the greatest selling author of his generation. I mean, amazingly, his books sold 1 million copies in the late 18th century. And he was slandered by the Continental Congress, and he was on death row during 1793 in Robespierre's Terror. And he died in greatest poverty. And I love Tom Paine. I think he was actually a deeply unpleasant man, a man with no sex life, who was a drunk, a rude man, but a wonderful man. And what I want to tell you about Tom Paine is when he lived in Lewes, when he'd abandoned the corset making and had an ill-fated career as an exciseman, he founded a society of young, half-educated, uneducated, educated people in Lewes, and they call themselves the Headstrong Club. And my view is that we shouldn't be bothering to talk about the media and what we do in the media, because actually it's all like a trade convention. It's not actually very interesting. The media deliver facts. They deliver accurate facts, so they should go on doing that, and Sky does that, and the BBC does that. No argument about it, please. It's different to Fox News, which on the whole delivers half-truths and lies, but we all know that. But what we really need, I'm afraid, are more people like Tom Paine. And to get more people like Tom Paine, we need more organizations like the Battle for Ideas, but we need to cultivate not just dull citizens journalism, which is a sort of basically uninteresting carbon copy of what used to be called real journalism. But we need to figure out who are the people who really have things to tell us about the world we live in. And they can come from anywhere, and they can be anyone. So I would invoke for you, in relation to the truth, the spirit of Tom Paine.
I think the TV culture in this country is very precious, and we need to look after it. British TV is very heavily regulated, much more than the press. And that's supposed to keep us television programme makers truthful. We couldn't have Fox News, for example. Ofcom wouldn't allow it, nor could we have the Daily Mail TV. Broadcasting hacked phone messages and uncorroborated claims about people's personal lives would also mean fines and sackings. And in fact, in 1996, a documentary on ITV about drug trafficking that was partly fabricated landed the TV station Carlton with a £2 million fine from the regulator, a massive penalty. But does TV regulation, much tougher than print media, get in the way of the public hearing the truth? Recently, I worked on the dispatches about Tony Blair on whether he was using his political position as Middle East envoy to further his commercial interests. And we discovered that he earned in 1 year £100 million. But we couldn't say that because Channel 4's lawyers wanted more corroboration than we could actually offer them. So we settled on a mere £20 million that we knew was uncontestable. Did regulation get in the way of the truth to save us a bad day in court? Well, we also had to inform Tony Blair in advance of the broadcast and offer him a right to reply. That's more than Max Mosley got from the News of the World. Despite this weight of regulation, though, Panorama, for example, was recently able to infiltrate a care home, impersonate employees and visitors, and film people secretly without anyone's permission. The result was a powerful, highly watchable, very important expose of serious wrongdoing. The hoop the programme makers had to jump through was a public interest justification. They had to demonstrate that there was good enough reason to break certain rules to reveal the bigger truth of wrongdoing. I kind of think that without the checks and balances, we in TV might find ourselves vulnerable to the same pressures to deliver sensational revelation as those working in the Rebecca Brooks era of News International have found, and that truth would be a casualty. I once had to investigate a factual programme that had turned out to be partly fabricated. As it happened, the show was originally commissioned for a US broadcaster where the rules are different. There was no single culprit. The whole team had crossed a line together. But the root of the problem was an intimidating commissioning editor wanting the show to be sexed up, and which no one in the production company dared to cross. So clear lines of what is and isn't acceptable should save us from that sort of pressure and keep us being honest. Can the rules get in the way of the truth? Should they be broken sometimes? A film I commissioned some years ago on the Magdalen laundries in Ireland told the terrible story of girls and young women incarcerated by nuns. But there was no actual pictorial evidence, and this was television. The production company then secured some shocking photographs of brutalised, shaven-headed women inmates. After the broadcast, I learned that the photographs had been stolen from a Catholic library. Was this clear by the broadcaster? No. Was it clear by me? No. Would they have blocked it, the broadcaster? Maybe. Or maybe there would have been a question of attribution. Was it worth it? Yes. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. After the transmission, the librarian told the thief we'd all burn in hell, but she couldn't corroborate that. Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers. Certainly a lot to discuss there, and perhaps the stuff on the organisational culture of the media and whether organisations themselves are a problem is certainly something we can come on to. But before going out to the audience, I just wanted to pick up on one particular idea. Mick had raised this idea of different versions of the truth. When we talked about the dangers of going with a story without having full corroboration, that's a lot of what Peter's been talking about. But John, let me come to you first, because you said that you can't afford now to just run with a story in a sense to chase ratings. You sounded like you think that's a good thing, but do you think there's anything lost in terms of a fear of taking risks, that maybe you should take risks to get at least a version of the truth out?
Yeah, I think when stories start to emerge, you have a choice, which is you can hold on to something and keep it to yourself while you check it as far as you can, or you can share it. Now, in the main, I would like to think we would share stuff. Now, I suppose a reasonable example I could give you now was the day that Gaddafi was killed, because we heard rumours that he'd been hanged by a lynch mob, and it was just Friday afternoon, I think. And then this first distressing still photo started to come through. Now, it was the middle of the afternoon. It's not something you want to put on telly, but you have a piece of the jigsaw there. So, you think, well, you've got a foreign editor saying, we do not know this history. This may well be him. This may well add a bit to the story. Do you broadcast it? Now, the decision I took was, yes, we should put it on there, because in the main, you can share. You should share these bits. You should add to the story if you can, with suitable warnings and checks. And you just got to be straight with people about what you're doing. So if you don't know it's right, say, look, we don't absolutely know, but this is what we think. And you've got to, give people the equipment to make their own decisions. Because I just think the alternative is you hang on to stuff, and there's certainly plenty of stories, especially in the political arena, that a certain amount of people, probably in this room, would know about a politician that the rest of the world doesn't know, yet they go out and vote for them. What I was saying in my piece about the downside, I suppose, is that a mistake will have more resonance and reputational damage, and in a world where large organisations are worried about their reputation in the light of Leveson and all that happens, I think the collateral damage can be worse.
Sure. Mick, can I put a similar question to you? If you'd been editor of The Sun at the time of the Hillsborough, and that's unlikely, but would you have run the story as this is what the police are claiming? Or, is that what you mean by different versions, or would you have taken a completely different approach?
Yeah, sorry. The answer to that, Dolan, is I wouldn't start from here. I've never put myself in the position of being the editor of The Sun. I'm very glad to say I don't have to take those kind of decisions. But the point I'm making about the Sun journalist was, he said, we have been told this story has been stood up by 4 senior police officers, one after another, and the local Tory MP. Now, if you're the editor of The Sun, you can't say, well, we don't believe a word of that, because that they are serious people making serious claims. Yeah. The guy wrote the story saying, this is what's claimed by the police. That's a version of the truth that's got to be put out there, contested and argued about. What Mackenzie said was, that is the truth, because it comes from those sources which I'm prepared to accept as verbatim. So I think it would have been quite wrong for any news organisation not to publish those things, if only to expose the fact that there was a latent conspiracy going on. But Mackenzie put his stamp on it, and that's why I'm saying that truth is always coloured by political opinions and where you stand in a debate, and the public has got to decide for itself. I think the point is, editors and journalists all the time in relation to what's the truth and what can we publish have always got to be making what I call judgment calls. And I think this is very important, that you're taking everything into account. You make a judgment call about when to go with the story, how hard to push it, which line you're going to take. And those are not something which can actually be decided in advance by a general... you can have a very general code of conduct, but I think all journalism codes are necessarily very vague and general, because whether a tactic is the right one to use, a reporting tactic, or a story is the right one to publish, will depend on the context in which it takes place. So there are very fine judgment calls you're making all the time, and you've got to keep your bullshit detector well honed and your wits about you when you're looking for the truth as a journalist, I think.
Does anyone else want to pick up on that? Nick, you've suggested that their organisations can be a problem, and certainly someone like Thomas Paine didn't have to worry about the reputational issues that John's highlighted.
No. He just had to worry about money. Well, I think these rules about journalism are fantastic and they're necessary, and you have to have codes, and I'm interested in the codes, but I actually don't think this has to do much to do with really wonderful reporting. I think wonderful reporting occurs because someone is smart enough and genuine enough and truthful enough to figure out what's going on. And I know there's a weakness in my position because I do documentaries, and you can tell if a documentary is full of lies or not very easily. It's Graham Greene said that when a dry rot inspector looked at a house, he could spot the dry rot right away. And so I don't think these rules are important. I think often you can rely on one witness, and if the one witness is the right witness, then you go with them. But I do think that in the making of daily news, you have to have a kind of set of codes and stuff. I don't have any problem with that, but it doesn't really have any bearing on my work at all.
Could I come in on that? Just that Irish television and radio, RTE, is rather modelled on the BBC. In many
Well,
respects.
rather not, I would say, actually.
Well, it likes to.
They like to think they are, yes.
They recently put out a programme about an abusive priest in Kenya, I think it was. And it turned out in the end that this man had never done anything wrong.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever.
Indeed.
But the point was the mindset of RTE had turned into always believing that anybody who accuses a priest of anything must be right. They had done a complete switch on the way they used to be 15 years ago. And the man was hanged essentially before.
Well, Ruth, I agree about that, but I don't think that tells you about anything except there are a lot of incompetent people working for RTE who shouldn't have their jobs.
No, but it's the same institution and mentality is what.
No, I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think that actually there are some very decent people working at RTE, and this was just a failure of all their systems. And I know about the story, and however, it has to be said that RTE did get its courage together and has transmitted a large number of shows about pedophile priests that were true in every particular. So I think you'd have to say
very
that.
late in the game.
Well, you can't have it both ways, you know. Yes, the Late Show ignored every scrap of evidence about pedophilia in the Catholic Church for many years. So busy were they celebrating the Catholic Church, but you know, belatedly, the RTE have done quite well on the pedophile front.
But they've just switched over to the other side. It's no better.
Sure, but that's not. I don't think that's necessarily an evidence of deep sickness in RTE, but incompetence probably.
We can argue about that another time.
Well, I mean, that's interesting in terms of the organisational culture shifting, because you talked about the BBC, and there are always examples of people within the BBC saying, yes, there's a really big problem at the BBC that we all agree and so on. Is that part of the BBC's reasonableness, that they've got this tendency to go along with that? Or is
No,
You know,
I don't know.
I've worked at the BBC, I've worked at Channel 4, and I've worked in one or two other places, and now I'm freelance. And you know, the longer I go on, the harder it gets to generalise about these cultures. I mean, there have been times, you know, I think there's a period recently where I found it much easier to deal with the BBC, much more open, much more bullish about stuff than Channel 4 were. You know, maybe it's the individuals I was dealing with, but I find it really hard to make these generalisations about the culture. And obviously the BBC is going through a frightful spasm at the moment, sort of you know, combination of just, you know, breathtaking bad crisis management, really. You know, heads will roll or whatever, and they'll probably be tightened something or others as a result of this. But, you know, they live on, and another part of the BBC, meanwhile, be doing some fantastic show that we're all going to feel very proud of, that not a lot of people in other countries could have made. So I find this, I just want to beware of this kind of talk about culture. I do think there's a problem, and it comes up, and it's not confined to, you know, any particular place, but there are times when people get bullied into doing stuff, and that's when truth suffers.
okay?
I'd make just a point, you know, Ruth, that you're a historian, and if you're looking at the BBC, I'm not defending the detail of the BBC, but you have to think of the BBC as a giant. It's like the golem. Do you know about the myth of the golem? It's a sort of robot that had a plug put in it. They went around doing everything. So imagine the BBC as the plug in the golem. And in world media, if you take the BBC plug out, what's left? So you have to ask yourself, in the same way as Susan Sontag with some courage did about Time magazine during the Cold War, if the BBC hadn't been there all those years, what would we have missed? Well, the answer is a huge amount of totally accurate, impartial news. So, of course, it's periodically a biased and incompetent and not always brave organisation, but I do think you have to remember that. It's been a force for a good kind of journalism for a long, long time, practically since it was created.
Okay, on that note, let's come out to the audience.
I'm Australian. We have a situation where our Prime Minister, 20 years ago when she was infatuated with a rogue, did something rather naughty. Now, it's come out more in the conservative media. In the left-wing media, she's been treated gently. Now, sometimes that's because some of them are true believers, but I think for some of the others, they may realise she's done something wrong, but the alternative would be to attack her and thereby promote, because we've got an election coming up in a year, the chances of the Conservative leader, whom they hate with such venom, that they would sooner say nothing and let this, our Prime Minister, get away with it, rather than promote somebody whom they see as so loathsome. So they're not telling untruths, they're just not telling the whole truth.
It strikes me that so often listening to news media that there's always an air of unreality or untruth to what we're told is big news or what's important news. So for the last month, the second most important issue we're told in the country that's gripping the country is that the chief whip lost his rag and swore at a copper, to the point where he's had to resign. And most of us in the real world know that is, it's of no real significance to most of us. That's an everyday occurrence. And yet, there's no questioning of that. And I find that really strange. And that happens all the time. I'd like your comments on that, if you like. I mean, I think it's probably got to do with the isolation of the political class, if you like. They're in their own little Westminster village, which half the time, the World at One and lots of news programmes just happily report uncritically. But, I think the news media goes along with it so much and, refuses to ever puncture that.
Well, I just wanted to echo what was said by the chap earlier, because I like the idea of, particularly documentary film or news just giving us the facts and nothing but the facts. But then I think about a lot of documentaries I see on TV now, where it now invariably has this format where you have a presenter who will make a big virtue of the fact they don't know anything about the subject, so they need to go on a journey to learn something about the subject. And they will present us with facts that they learn across the journey that they're making, and they will come to a conclusion. But the problem is that the conclusion they often come to isn't particularly journalistic or hard-hitting. They've just, they will go to a source, they will take that information, and they will choose it and then present it from there. Now, I've not been lied to in that process. I'm not, I'm not going to suggest that the documentary makers are not, again, presenting me with untruths. But I don't feel as if I learn very much. I don't often feel that there's much servants of truth in it. So surely there's a little bit more to get into the truth than seeking facts in that regard. And that's something which seems to be in retreat from, particularly across documentaries, just as a medium, not picking anyone out on the panel, but also across news organisations more generally.
There's a terrific episode of Ricky Gervais's sitcom Extras, where the lead character is accused early on in The Sun of having insulted a mentally handicapped child. And throughout the sequence, slowly the story gets worse and worse to the point where he's hit both the mother and her son in a restaurant. And the payoff is, of course, his agent believes it the following day when he's accusing him of having done this. And we all laughed, and it was very funny. But I can't help but look at the Jimmy Savile story and think there's something very similar going on, where it's become very quickly accepted that all these things happened, and the truth is out there already as to what occurred. And no one at any point seems to have said, well, actually, I don't think we're ever really going to find out the truth because the chap who's being accused of this is dead. And so I'm wondering whether or not this kind of culture of just simply believing that the voices of the people, the victims, as it were, is so widespread now that we actually don't even go, in many cases, chasing after the truth, or at least explaining the fact that we may never know the truth.
Well, I do think there is a need everywhere for a resident devil's advocate. So when the Savile story broke, there is a need for people to be sitting there saying, OK, but do we have to believe everybody who makes these allegations? Yes, a lot of them are probably true because so many people in the BBC sniffed it out before but couldn't prove it. But I'd like to go back, if I could, just to the point about Andrew Mitchell being the lead story. I was appalled with Sky yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, when Andrew Mitchell's resignation was at the top of the news. It was the most important item at a time when a murderer was running around Cardiff killing people, or killing one person and injuring women and children. I couldn't believe that was regarded as being less important than that the chief whip, whom not 1% of the people in this country have heard of, that he had finally packed it in. I absolutely agree with you that it's all back, and it's the oldest cliche in the book. It's the bloody Westminster bubble. This is the fact that everything happens in London, and the absurdity of the dear old BBC doing its best to decide to take 10,000 people out of London and stick them in Salford. They'll just be still with each other. Wasn't it Caroline Thompson, when she resigned from the BBC, said, "Oh dear, yes, well, we were a bit too prone to, be friends with each other and have affairs with each other and marry each other." And all. They're doing that in Salford now. It just
The thing about the Mitchell story, to defend it a bit, is that it wasn't about the fact that he swore at these policemen, which is pretty horrible behaviour and all of that. It was the fact that the story was how badly it was handled. And that, once again, the top table sort of struggled to know what to do with someone who'd made a real balls of it and was causing grief and embarrassment. And part of the story was that we were talking about this guy and whether he'd used the word pleb or whether he'd sworn at these, which is, as you say, is an everyday occurrence. But it's an everyday occurrence that should have been dealt with. Now, it could have been dealt with by the police themselves, could have been dealt with by Cameron, who say, oi, get in front of a camera, say sorry, or resign. Now, for as long as it didn't go on, in among other sort of PR disasters ongoing, that kept it alive, really. The lead story yesterday on Sky, certainly for the most part of the day, was the hit and runs. But I take the point. We spent a good deal of time talking about it, probably too much.
Okay, well, I'd be the first person to agree with you. Very good comment about the inanity of, sub-literate, sub-everything, contemporary factual shows that are called documentaries. Try not to do them. I think the Jimmy Savile thing, I can't really talk about because it upsets me too much in a variety of ways. I think you do have to understand, actually, the smartest comment about Jimmy Savile was made by Ian Hislop on Have I Got News For You, that often these things come out on the BBC but in other places, not on the news, but on other intelligent programmes where things are commented on. And in that context, it takes time to get the truth of things. But I did think the last episode last night, The Thick of It, I thought it was close to genius. I thought it finally managed to say, through this invented investigation into spin in broadcasting, in spin in politics, it managed to say, it's always been trying to say every episode, what's wrong with our contemporary politics? And I felt last night, finally they got there. But it takes time. You can't. It brings me back to Tom Paine. You can't do this every day. You have to try very hard to do it, and you hope you have institutions capable of supporting people who want to try.
Well, I think the Mitchell thing is a legitimate story, and it became important because it was not in its own terms, but because it was symbolic of something else. Both of seen as symbolic of an elitist attitude towards coppers, who, as we all know, are pigs, not plebs. They're properly described. And on the other hand, towards the incompetence and the confusion in the government's handling of it. So it's a legitimate story, but obviously its elevation into something which is more important than, the Syrian civil war or anything bar Jimmy Savile, is a reflection of something I talked about in my book, which is the kind of narcissism of the media political class, of its kind of self-obsession, and the fact that everyone's pursuing their own little agenda in relation to getting the government. Everybody from the police to the press is using it for their own purposes. However, I do believe that everything does happen in London, and it's a great mistake for the BBC to try and imagine that it can transport the capital of Britain to Salford, a city where my wife comes from, that I have great affection for, but which I do not think is the place that the national broadcaster should be running its national affairs from. On the Savile thing, I think this is interesting. It goes back to what Ruth was talking about before, about the Catholic abuse scandal. And there you had what was broadly seen as a blanket denial of the truth for many years. So immediately, anybody that said anything was refused to be listened to, so we have an absolute denial. Now you have the opposite. And I'm not sure if that's any more helpful in getting to the truth either, which is you have an automatic acceptance of whatever anybody says happened. You have a situation where finger-pointing becomes the equivalent of evidence and guilt. You see, and we have this idea that, which for very good reasons, people say you have to believe the victims. Well, of course, they are only, as the best media I think have pointed out, actually alleged victims. They are claimants in these circumstances. And whilst treating people with great respect, there is a tradition in our society of actually believing the accused, in as much as there is a presumption of innocence until somebody's proven guilty. Now, far be it from me to come out and say that Jimmy Savile is innocent. I would never like to want to go down that road. But I do think, there's something else going on here, which is another kind of the flip side knee-jerk reaction, and that doesn't help us get at the real truth either, because it becomes impossible in both cases. It becomes unacceptable to question what's going on. And even people like John Humphreys have got into trouble by asking rather mild questions about some of the things that have been said around the Jimmy Savile thing. And I think we must leave open the possibility of questioning allegations and accusations, however heartfelt and serious they might be. Otherwise, we are getting into crucible country. And I don't think that helps get into the truth either.
We're in the eye of the storm here of this story, and it's often very hard to kind of report it. I don't envy anyone in news kind of covering this, and I can sort of sit back and come along and maybe make a documentary months later. But I think that right now, whether the victims' stories are valid or not is not what anyone should be focusing on. I mean, I think obviously a dam has burst, and an awful lot of people are finding that it's possible to say things that they were never able to say for years and years and years. But I think the questions about the institutional failings of where the story is, how it was that Edwina Currie was able to appoint Jimmy Savile to look after Broadmoor at one point. I mean, how did this happen? And of course there are questions about the BBC. If there were allegations, how did people turn them around? And then the BBC has its own very big problem at the moment about how it reconciles the fact that a programme didn't happen, investigating his misdeeds, and yet broadcast a tribute programme to him some weeks after. And that's the big one, I think, right now. So I think there are institutional questions, and also, it's not just confined to Broadmoor and the BBC. This is, how did other places hand over keys to places, or let Savile park his wagon on the grounds? These are the questions, and I'm afraid this is the really upsetting thing, which we really have to focus on in the media, is looking forensically at those institutional failings and understanding them.
The responsibility of the press is to protect people. Not go after. Well, protect people from a perspective of, if people are doing that, expose them so it doesn't happen again. And that's fundamentally the big issue. And why that didn't happen is really, and what's happening today that we don't know about, where people could be protected.
We're invited to answer a question in the preamble that I've got here, which is, should we drop the old idea that journalism shouldn't indulge in opinion, but simply equip people with the information to make up their own minds? I think what that's getting at is the merging of facts and opinion. Yesterday, the Battle of Ideas debate, there was a journalist who was clearly on the campaign trail, but when asked the question about whether they were campaigning, they said, "Oh no, I'm reporting the news." But it just didn't make sense to anybody who was at that debate. So I just wondered whether or not, in the light of this, and whether, if you like, the facts, pursuing the facts, if you've got an opinion behind that when you're doing it, actually leads to the sort of distortion that I think is obvious in much of the press, and I have seen it on Sky TV News as well, just for the record.
I would like to ask if the issue is that we are actually too few, so now I'm pointing the fingers at the audience, not the panel, if we are too few who are buying the better journalistic pieces. And I guess the leader, or say, what leads me to that question is, are the educational system insufficient in training us to be skeptical?
I remember the first time I ever came across the word paedophile. We used to call them dirty old men, but in 1974, the Sunday People had an investigation into an organisation called the Paedophile Information Exchange. What actually happened to that organisation was it was basically broken up, and its leadership some of its leadership were imprisoned. But the one thing that I think strikes me about that time and today is how there was a less hysterical response to that Sunday People story. And it went on for quite a few weeks, and it took, I think, the Department of Justice. I think it took them about 2 years before they had before anybody was actually imprisoned. And I think, to me, that speaks of a time where, I'm not saying it was a golden era, but a time where society seemed to have more confidence in itself and more trust in authority. I do appreciate, actually, at the time that there was also civil rights issues as well. But the point I'm making was that this horrendous word, this demonisation, paedophile, was actually treated in a very measured way, and things got done without the accompanying hysteria. And you actually got to a level of proof: were these people guilty of something? And it took time to do that, whereas you don't have that today.
I was just wanting to ask the panel whether they thought the effects of the Hutton inquiry have been beneficial to the BBC or cowed the BBC, and what your views are on what is likely to happen with Leveson in terms of the BBC and the rest of the press, his approach to truth.
Sort of going back to what Ruth was saying about how there's a sort of culture within organisations where they kind of recruit from themselves and so forth. Could you kind of extend that to the readership, viewership and listenership? In the sense that each organisation or organ or title sort of picks its own audience. It works to its own market, as someone described it in an earlier session today. And I think we all kind of pick the thing, the paper, the kind of programme we watch or the radio that we listen to, along what we think is the most objective. But what the most objective thing is obviously usually the kind of thing where we agree with that slant, with that way of going about it. It's not necessarily a sense of, oh, this has the best fact-checking or something like that. We agree with the kind of the slant. And I just want to ask all the panel if they feel there's a certain coziness that you can get with your audience.
I worked on Big Brother in the early days, the third one, with Jade Goody. And one of the things that was really striking when Big Brother happened was that the broadsheet newspapers, were just horrified by this. How dare, Channel 4, lowering standards, etc., etc., etc. And I thought it was quite striking because I checked out what the reaction to The Family was, that Paul Watson's amazing documentary series about the Wilkins, where he followed a fairly feckless family of people who similarly, there was a huge, particularly from the left, disgust at this series, that somehow this was kind of betraying some kind of confidence that we should be. Anyway, so I think that there is inevitably people are going to, I can try and make programs, for as wide a group of people as I can, but yeah, probably a lot of them are, I'm sort of preaching to, if I'm really honest, as a freelancer. I go for the ones I want to, most interested in, and I can imagine the people who are going to want to watch them, whether they're about, Tony Blair, or I do quite a lot of car programs for some reason. So I think that, I think that's kind of not invalid. I don't think it's a bad thing, because I think if everything was trying to reach everybody, it would all be a bit bland. That's what happens a lot in American television, where it's so, we've got to reach everybody. It's rounded down, down, down.
It's very hard to address this question of facts and opinion, because most journalism has got opinion jumbled up with facts. I think you tend to know when it's good journalism, when the person whose opinions it is who writes the piece has given you sufficient homage as a reader to know that you're going to want to know about the facts as well as their opinions about the facts. And obviously this is very difficult with tight deadlines and with rolling news when there's no time to do that. In Scandinavia they have journalism schools and ethical schools, and I spent a long time once trying to explain to a Scandinavian editor why no one at News International had been to journalism school that I could see. As for the measured way of treating pedophilia in the past, I don't know. I mean, British schools were full of beating and sodomy for 200 years and nobody complained about it, and maybe that they do complain now is not such a bad thing. I think last question is that the BBC has a different relationship to people because it's not selecting its readership or its viewership or its listenership on the basis of that they pay for something. It's a national broadcaster, so they have to have the widest selection for the staff, regional, ethnic, etc. And whether they've done that quite adequately is up for you to judge rather than me to judge, though I think they tried to do it. But maybe it's very difficult, maybe they don't succeed very well, but I know they tried to do it.
There's so many strands of this, I don't know where to start. Big Brother. I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial if you are taking an interest in politics and society that you should, first of all, read the things you don't like, read the things that are taking a point of view that is not yours, and that you should watch programs that are despised in the broadsheets. And I was a devoted follower of Big Brother in the early days. I found it enormously illuminating until the stage when it was self-selecting freaks that became the people there. It was marvellous, and J.D. Goody was an utterly fascinating and very impressive person in many ways. But the self-satisfaction of readers of the right kind of newspaper and listeners to the right kind of programme, I've always found absolutely insufferable. I don't like dinner parties, and one of the reasons is that there's always that moment when you think, oh God, I'm going to question that point of view because I have to, and then it's all going to descend into how could you think such a thing? How could you have watched that terrible programme? How could you have read that terrible man? How could you? And all the rest of it. Julia Gillard, you were talking earlier, that thing that went viral of Julia Gillard on sexism. I mean, I can just hear the dinner parties that I'm not at anymore, thank God. You know, if I had said, yes, but she's a pretty rotten prime minister, they all have dumped the dinner all over your head, metaphorically. You know, omission is a huge thing in this, and self-satisfaction. If there's one thing, and I'm a devoted listener to Radio 4, I can't stand the fact that the comedians always have to be left-wing. I would like the odd right-wing, if it was at all possible, but the self-satisfaction is what drives me mad, even though I love it. And one of the things about it is, and you hear it again and again on the BBC, some interviewers saying, oh well, the truth lies in the middle. It always lies in the middle. And I'm there shouting, no, it bloody well doesn't necessarily lie in the middle. Quite often it lies on something near an extreme. There are such things as good and evil and right and wrong. So anyway, that's the end of my rant.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the question of comment and fact always been a major issue in broadcast, both in print and in broadcasting. Obviously, the old Guardian editor C.P. Scott's, kind of high declaration for the moral high ground that comment is free but facts are sacred is something that everyone, has long seen as being something that we should try and achieve, although it's easier said than done. But I do think there's something new now in terms of the overlapping of the two and the confusion between the two that does stray into dangerous territory sometimes. I say this as someone who, by the way, as far as documentaries are concerned, I would like to see more authored documentaries. I do think the point that's been made about simply the facts is a recipe for very dull TV with a celebrity fronting it or something. I would like to see more authored documentaries, and I don't just mean all of them about climate change. I mean, something actually, some kind of challenging authored documentaries in the world. I think
there are not actually many about
climate change.
I have to tell you that there are very, very few documentaries about climate change. All of them are watched by nobody.
Yeah, good. But just to come back to this point about one of the dangerous overlaps I think now is something that I talk about in the book is the narcissism, tendency of narcissism in media reporting. And the tendency of journalists now to assume the role of crusaders, of those who believe their job is not simply to report the world, but somehow to save it. And I think this is a dangerous road we're going down. And one of the dangers of being a crusader is you can end up seeing what you want to see rather than everything that is there. And that's where I think the question of facts and opinion gets confused. For example, why did so many journalists and media institutions accept the case for the war against Iraq in 2003? Not all of them did, but why did so many of them? Nobody could suggest for a second it was because of the convincing facts accumulated by the government in their so-called dodgy dossier. It was because they were either some of them just predisposed to believe what governments tell them, but I think a more important tendency was those who were predisposed to looking for a new crusade against evil in the world.
No, I don't.
And if I can finish, you can say what you like. When Bush said,
that's good.
When Bush says Saddam Hussein is the equivalent of Hitler and Stalin, this was signed up to by both left and right-wing journalists who said we believe this. We believe he's got the weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to sign up for this crusade. And then when it becomes clear that there are no weapons of mass destruction, they all say, "Oh, we've been duped. We've been duped by Alistair Campbell and his kind of subliterate claims produced by these students in the Foreign Office in this dossier that was put out. They haven't been duped, been self-deluded into believing what they wanted to see was there that wasn't there. So I think that's where, for me, there's a danger in a confusion of comment and news, is when journalists assume the role of crusaders and start seeing what they want to see rather than everything that might be there, or not there in that case.
Yeah, just on the point about comment, in fact, from a television rolling news broadcast, you mentioned Sky News. I actually think it should be packed full of comment and opinion. And there should be more argument, and we go to great lengths to provide it. I just don't think it should come from us. I think it has to come clearly from contributors. I don't just mean because we get into trouble with Ofcom. There's no market for it. If people on our programme stray into opinion, our viewers let us know very readily that that's not what they expect of us. It's not what they want. And I think it's for us to steer clear of it. I don't think anyone. I mean, people talk about sort of foxification of news up here. I know it couldn't happen, but I just don't know if anyone would want it. And on the point of audiences, sort of finding their niche with the output. I mean, we go after audiences quite sort of readily, and I'm quite sort of proud of that, because what we do is have a good look at what kind of news, how they want it presented, what they're interested in, things like that. And I'm very glad to say so. It's why when there is a big news story, be it sort of, I don't know, rolling into Tripoli or earthquake or whatever, the audiences just go up like that, because they find us when they want that. And some of the time they don't. On a normal Tuesday in August, frankly, our audiences might not do terribly well. But when the big thing happens, we've got to make sure we're there to give them as much as we can, as quickly as we can. And they seem to respond.
Just on the question of the Iraq War, my impression is actually that the broadcast coverage of the run-up to the Iraq War was actually rather good and balanced. And the BBC, as you know, gave air to a lot of voices opposed to the war. I think the real problem about the war was that the politicians overrode opinion and, with disastrous effects further down. I just want to say, look, if anyone can show me this wonderful place in the BBC where everyone has it off with each other and they all live in wonderful buildings, they all like each other, tell me about it, because I work in a building that looks faintly like a set for something in the GDR. And I meet every day people actually who are in a state of doubt about things and sceptical, and that's why they work for me, and that's why I love them. And I think a lot of people like that are in the BBC, and I don't think it's a sort of giant sort of liberal gangbang, actually.
Somebody mentioned in passing the Hutton report, and I think that's had a malign effect on the BBC. Obviously, the emphasis on balance is always a tricky one, but the BBC has, since then, it seems to be, been running scared of being accused of having a left-wing bias. As a result of which, the most catastrophic piece of legislation that has ever hit the welfare state has gone through without any serious debate of its implications. And I'm referring to Andrew Lansley's NHS and Social Care Bill. If you look at the coverage, again and again, the mantra was, this is giving budgets to general practitioners. In fact, if you dug 2 inches into the bill, you could see its entire purpose was to open up the NHS to the free market, which will actually damage the NHS beyond recognition. And it was extraordinary how little the BBC, even Today programme, which I admire enormously, actually dug beneath the surface mantras because it was frightened of being accused of being too left-wing. And I think that's the enduring damage of the extraordinary Hutton report.
I agree with you about the Hutton report. I thought his conclusions were disgraceful, and they seem to outlaw the capability of the BBC to do investigative journalism. I think what you're saying is very interesting about Lansley's bill, and you should write me an email and I'll forward it to people, because I agree with you.
Just quickly on the Iraq War, there has been quite a lot of documentation about the amounts of coverage and in the lead-up and also after the war began, and it's not balanced coverage. It clearly isn't, and I think it really goes to the heart of the matter, the truth. When you're talking the truth of the media.
You mean the war or the lead-up?
Well, both, actually.
I don't agree with you.
Well, there is coverage. There's a book called Pockets of Resistance.
Yeah, but they
and it does say there are pockets of resistance. But my point basically being that quite a few politicians have been forced to say, well, they got it wrong. But the media, New York Times, in fact, in 2004, printed an apology and said, we got this wrong. But not one British newspaper or broadcaster has done the same.
I'm a subscriber to Private Eye. I then, read it and then I'm infuriated and think, and then what? Obviously, you don't want crusaders, and I completely understand that. But what is the point if nothing changes?
On that issue, news versus comment, I absolutely agree with Mick criticizing these crusader journalists. However, I think there's also another trend that seems to be dangerous too. Last year, is this American newspaper, name starts with Wall and ends with a street journal. They set up this German branch, and they were looking for journalists. So I had a job interview, and obviously somehow they liked me, and they wanted to give me that job. And then they said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we sent you our ethical code." And this ethical code basically said to me, close down your website, don't comment on anything, close down your Facebook account. We don't want anything else to hear from you apart news and facts. We don't want you to sit on a platform. we don't want you to take part in public discussions mentioning who you're actually working for. And the reason for that was that the official reason was we don't want that because we take our readers seriously. And and our aim is it to just report news. So what I want to say is that, okay, I hate journalism of attachment, but what I also hate is the journalism of detachment.
It just occurs to me there are sort of three forces at work when there's a news story or there's something out there which people feel is important. And I think one is the viewpoint of the person reading the story or looking at it, or the viewer or the audience. And one is the person giving it to them and saying, these are just the facts, this isn't my opinion. And the third thing, which I think is really insidious and applies to Hillsborough at the time, and indeed applies to the Savile thing at the time, and indeed applies to the priests in the Catholic Church, is the prevailing opinion. The huge swell, the great big tsunami that is pushing you in a particular direction. And in the 70s and 80s, it was that football, they were called football hooligans. There was a firm, a particular group of them who used to run up and down on the trains, knifing people, and it was generally agreed that they were evil and bad, and it was okay to say this. Women and girls, such as those almost certainly abused by Savile, were regarded as shallow, trivial, and unreliable, and that was the context we were in. I'm sure we don't need to go into the same thing for the church. So what I'm saying is what I think is the hardest job, and how can we do this job, us in and out of the media, is to withstand this enormous force that says, oh, all these people are like this. And that's what Kelvin Mackenzie was like. I know because I worked for him as a freelancer. And he went on these crusades and he'd say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. He didn't care what people thought. And Rupert, I think, was evidently behind him. So how do we deal with that huge force that says, oh, we must all think this, but we can't question that? How do we do that?
I think there's no harm in being a bit philosophical, not least because journalism had its origins in the coffee house halfway between the Royal Exchange, of London's financial district of the time, and John Locke's study. So let me put forward to you the following more or less philosophical proposition, that there is what happened, and then there are accounts of what happened, human subjective constructions of what happened. And that's no bad thing. It's a very good thing, in fact, that we can develop our subjectivity in order to seek to arrive at an objective account of what did originally happen. Of course, there are different levels of construction. There is, if you like, truth light that just doesn't want to get it wrong. There is interpersonal truth, which is how the story seemed to me and the other people who were caught up in it. And there is an essentialist, higher, I suggest, aspiration to get, indeed, at that which is essential about what happened, and that often means removing that which was contingent. In other words, editing out the stuff that's peripheral and secondary. The fact that the striving for objectivity in this way is a subjective human construction is a very good thing for all of us. We wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And thank goodness that we can, because it makes the truthfulness of journalism a possibility as well as a necessary thing that we should be striving for.
Yes, people have explained very well how the victim's truth is too often too easily believed in news, for example, and also on the other end of the scale, where there's more sort of authorship and subjectivity in telling stories about reality and documentary filmmaking. Some documentaries are coming out now where you just can't quite believe that what they did was true or what they're reporting on is true. It's sort of manufactured. And I suppose what both elements of journalism and documentary filmmaking have in common is that they have to have some relationship to the truth. Otherwise, it's entertainment, it's fiction, and so forth. And I was just wondering what the panel thought of objectivity, because it's been a word that hasn't been used at all, and we're talking about the truth. And it's also a word that seems to be, well, have a very bad reputation. It's seen as something where if someone says, oh, I'm being objective, they're somehow putting a sort of totalitarian boot on people's faces. So I was just wondering what the panel thought of objectivity and whether it should be resurrected in the spirit of trying to get the facts right, but also trying to make truth claims. We're all more self-conscious of how we come to define what we see as the truth.
Well, I suppose in the end, the thing I think to hold on to is that, there are facts and there is truth. And to be honest, I don't know what the truth is. I think the truth is what you decide it is. That's the best way I can say it after, wrestling with it for most of my working life. I think that it is absolutely true that there should, and could and can be more ordinary people, ordinary voices, on television, challenging people. Let's not forget that the only person who ever spooked Margaret Thatcher on television was she a housewife?
Yeah, she was.
Can I use that term?
Yeah, she absolutely got it,
asked a question too far about the Belgrano. It's the only time Margaret Thatcher was ever wrong-footed, and I never forget that. And I have seen some fantastic other instances over the years where people have challenged politicians when a camera happened to be running. I just want to close by saying one thing about Salford, though. And, in many ways it does look like a terribly cynical move. But do you know what? I was watching that Road to Coronation Street film about the drama about the making of Coronation Street. Coronation Street would never have happened, written by a local guy, employing all those local actors. It would never have happened had Granada not been based in Manchester. And I suspect that what will happen is all those people who moved up to Salford, they won't like it. They'll come back to London, and they'll clear the way for all the people who do live up there to get in and do. I do think that, it's a rather sort of blunt move, but I think actually over time Salford will be a success. Thank you.
I'm really grateful for the speech you made about objectivity, because I regard myself as being doomed to objectivity. I think that you can actually be personal and objective at the same time. I do actually think that a writer like Orwell displayed these qualities. And don't remember, in 1984, he envisages a political regime capable of abolishing objectivity. I think it's very precious. I think in the future, with the direction the internet is taking, that objectivity will be prized more and more. That people who set out to tell you the truth do a better job of reporting the Iraq War, give different sides of the question, but come to conclusions that are truthful, will become extremely valuable. But I think the real challenge, as Peter said also, is to try to combine this valuable tradition with as many voices, a real pluralism of expression from outside. We have a wonderful opportunity to have pluralistic expressions of views from all over the world, courtesy of the internet, and we should go for it, but we should take objectivity more seriously.
Oh, I agree with Peter that real voices are the best way to take ourselves out of the way and try and get to the story. Now, we're always insistent when we go, whether it's Syria or Cardiff, whatever story we're doing, that in the main we have this expression that we must turn the cameras away from ourselves and onto the people taking part. And I think that's a hugely important piece of what we do. Now, I'd love to take you all to a Sky News editorial meeting, but I won't. But I think you would be interested, and I hope encouraged by the lengths that we go to, and I know from 12 years in BBC News as well, to make sure as best we can that we are being fair to the participants, the subjects of stories, and the audience who are going to see it, and to try and hit from all angles and get all expressions of opinion on. And God knows in a 24-hour news cycle you've got room for it. So crucially, for me, it's about keeping the audience at the heart of everything we do, really.
Just 3 footnotes, really. One is about ordinary people. I recently had to sit on a panel in West Belfast with George Galloway, which was not something I looked forward to, because I'd seen him savaging the whole US Senate, so I didn't think I had much chance. But what I did remember was, having been an aficionado of Big Brother, I remembered his performance. And I don't mean the Lurex suit and the cap. I mean what I carried away from that one more than anything else was that at the end, an airhead called Chantel something, nice girl, but not bright. I remembered her telling him that he was a great big bully. And I remember her boyfriend standing up to him, who was somebody from a boy band. And by a miracle, before the panel, somebody told me that Craig Brown's one-on-one book actually had a transcript of the encounter. So I threw that at Galloway towards the end of the panel. It was one of my better moments in life, actually. And that's the point. She didn't have the baggage. You know, she had watched this man for a few weeks. She didn't know what he was on about. He was boring her, actually. But in the end, she recognised a bully when she saw one. That's great. I love those encounters. Second thing, herd mentality. I went into journalism in the early 90s because it seemed to me that nobody was writing the truth about the IRA anymore because they were so anxious to bring them in from the fold. And I found myself in a group in Irish writers who were known as being anti-peace process. And somehow the whole Sinn Féin thing had proven that if you are critical of them, you're against peace. And somehow one friend once finished a column saying, just because I never murdered anyone doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It was like that, because the whole herd had gone after peace at all costs, peace at any price. Third thing, objectivity. I think you must have come in a bit late, because I started off talking about objectivity because at my father's knee I was being told that was what I had to try. What I've learned is that you must try to be objective. You will never be objective, but you should try to correct. So when you're looking at a story, you should always doubt yourself, and you should ask somebody that you know thinks differently from you if you're getting it right. It's all checks and balances, but yes, that's what we should all be following.
On the question of objectivity, very difficult question. Someone like me, it might sound a bit rich talking about it because I don't work for the BBC, I don't have to stuck by their codes. I'm a political journalist and also a self-confessed propagandist, which, as I had to point out yesterday, doesn't mean liar, despite the popular perception that it does. I always take a subjective political line in an argument, but I still recognise the absolute importance of objectivity in journalism, and particularly in news journalism. And what worries me now is, and it's always been very difficult to achieve, no one could suggest otherwise, but what worries me is that I talk to journalists and journalism students who discount the idea that objectivity is even something we should be striving for. That worries me greatly, because I think, if you're really going to say, well, objectivity is impossible, you can never be objective, and so we shouldn't bother trying. If you really go down that road, then you end up as, we might as well call ourselves poets or playwrights or something, rather than journalists. So I do think that it's important to hold on to objectivity, difficult as it is, as a kind of a backbone of news journalism. I think someone asked what would be the consequences of Leveson for all of this, something that I've been talking about a lot, and I think, if the only consequence of it is likely to be at the moment an increasingly conformist and sanitised press and media. I think we already live in a society where our media, for all of its qualities, is too conformist and too sanitised. And if, looking from the outside, if I had a criticism of the BBC, which I think does some very good things, but I had a criticism of it, it would be that it is far too conformist. Often it's conformism in the name of diversity, even. And I think that atmosphere is likely to get worse after Leveson. And so we need to encourage the tradition of questioning everything if we want to get to the truth. And raising unpopular opinions, which is very hard to do inside of institutions, but we now have the opportunity for all kinds of things outside those institutions, web publishing and so on, which means the debate can be opened up. Lastly, Tom Paine is also one of my great heroes. An old friend of mine, a trade unionist from Manchester, we used to love telling me that the working class of England, and particularly of Manchester, taught itself to read in order to read the rights of man. And I think that is a lesson from history about not underestimating your audience. Not underestimating your audience and being prepared to pitch difficult arguments to them and accepting that some people won't get it and a lot of people will. And having the courage of your convictions, which means you have to have, by the way, both courage and convictions in order to do that, something which is absent in a lot of political discussion today. Having the courage of your convictions to speak the truth as you understand it and take the consequences for that. One of my other heroes, who I'll finish with, is Dr. Samuel Johnson, whose view of this was summed up by the usual pithiness that every man has the right to utter what he thinks truth, and every other man has the right to knock him down for saying it, figuratively at the very least.
On that note, thanks to the panel.